What will I need to deal with in terms of different voltages or frequencies in Mexico?
There's no difference to the United States. Electrical power in Mexico is available in the same nominal voltages and frequencies as the US. It is different from Europe and some other areas of the world. But a single phase power is available in nominal voltages of 120 and 240. And 120 is the standard voltage for residential and light load use. Three-phase power is available in 240 and 480, and the standard frequency in Mexico is 60 hertz.
And what's the power quality like in Mexico, Dave?
Well, it can run a bit hot, and the frequency can be a bit low, but in general, only the most sensitive applications will need power conditioning. In most cases, conditioning is not required, and it's certainly not generally used.
And what about uptime?
It's pretty good by international standards. Outages are infrequent and they're usually of short duration. Like most countries, weather's the most common cause of outages, but power is usually restored very quickly. So unless you have a requirement for an uninterruptible power source or you have some sensitive processes or equipment, it's very rare for companies to require generating capacity or local power backup.
Great. And who supplies electricity in Mexico? Is it private? Is it public?
Electricity is supplied mainly by the state-owned Comisión Federal de Electricidad, or CFE. The CFE controls most generation, most transmission, and most distribution. Mexico was in the process of deregulating its electricity sector under the previous administration, but that process has essentially stopped and some of the reforms have been reversed by the current administration. So the future of power and the electrical market isn't really clear yet.
And what are the typical electricity rates that manufacturers should expect to see in Mexico?
Well, for our client base, they currently run around 11.5 cents US per kilowatt hour. And that includes demand charges, time of use, and power factor charges. This is pretty competitive with most of North America for mid-range industrial users, and it's lower than many U.S. jurisdictions. It's also, incidentally, comparable to power rates in China. Mexico used to be a relatively high-cost power jurisdiction with a lot of its power generated pretty inefficiently using fossil fuels. The deregulation era brought about a rate competition environment, and investment was made in alternative power generation and efficiency improvements, renewable energy, that kind of thing. But as I mentioned, changes by the current administration have reversed some of those trends. So the rates are certainly competitive right now, but it's not clear what the future might bring. So companies do need to consider that.
And let's say I'm ready to get started in Mexico. What are the steps that I need to take to connect to electrical power?
Well, first of all, you need to make sure there's adequate supply to the building you intend to occupy. We mentioned this in some of our previous podcasts on real estate, because you can find properties and buildings which are not adequately serviced, and then you might end up being responsible for the upgrade costs. If so you want it to be part of your negotiations. Same goes for connections. In some cases, power will be connected to your building by the landlord or the developer. But in other cases, you will have to do the connection yourself. You have to pay for it. Sometimes connecting to the mains is going to be your cost. The next thing to do is establish your peak demand. CFE charges a one-time fee of approximately $100 US per kVA for peak demand above 200 kVAs. Most industrial users will need more capacity than that, so you will need to pay the demand charge if you need more than 200 kVAs. And just a warning, CFE monitors peak demand. If you exceed what you paid for, they can, and they do, shut off the power supply. Now, once you know your peak demand, then you'll need to look at transformer capacity. Landlords typically provide some level of transformer capacity with their buildings. They may even cover some of the demand charges if they provide more than 200 kVA. But usually, they only include a minimal level of power, which keeps the lights on and maybe runs the office air conditioning, but it's not available for much else. So the tenant often has to provide whatever additional transforming capacity is required. And as I mentioned, maybe pay that CFE demand charge. Now, when you're deciding on transformer capacity, CFE generally does not like people to exceed 80% of the rated capacity. So you're going to need to purchase a large enough transformer to make sure you don't exceed that limit. Now, also, of course, it's usually more economical in the long run to install more transforming capacity than you actually require to leave yourself some room for expansion. And incidentally, the available transformer capacity does not affect the demand charge you pay CFE. They're really only concerned about what your actual peak demand is when they calculate and monitor your usage. So you can always put in a larger transformer, but you only purchase the additional peak capacity when you actually need it.
Perfect. So now I have power to my building and I've installed a large enough transformer and I paid for my peak demand. But what do I have to do to connect my machinery and equipment?
Tenants and owners are typically going to be responsible for running the internal wiring in their buildings, as is the case in the United States. And the exception to that, of course, is whatever the landlord provides in terms of minimal lighting and office areas with perhaps outlets and air conditioning. Otherwise, you need to run the power yourself. So to be permitted to run and connect the wiring, you will need to prepare a wiring plan. It has to indicate the power loads you intend to connect and the wiring that you plan to install and the circuits and so on. This has to be reviewed by a Mexican electrical engineer who's going to certify it and then submit it to CFE for their approval. And once CFE has approved it, then you can proceed with the work and connect to the power source. There's a cost. Typically, it's in the range of about $3,500 US for the process, including the engineering review. But more importantly, it takes time. So it's wise to start well ahead of when you want to occupy your building. I would recommend having a plan in place and approved at least 3 months ahead of when you plan to occupy your building. Longer if your wiring and connection work is extensive.
Great. And anything else I need to take into account with respect to electricity?
Yes, CFE is going to ask for a bond in order to start your service. The amount of the bond is based on your anticipated billings. Now, most utilities and data providers are also going to ask for payment bonds. And in some cases, you may be able to negotiate for the bond to be reduced or eliminated, but not with CFE. They're going to insist. Typically, it's going to cost something like $1,000 to $5,000 US to put in place, less if you use a small amount of power, more if you use more power.
Great. So I think we now have a good understanding of how electricity works, how to get power connected, how to get our lights on, the estimated fees associated with payment bonds and expected demand. So I think we're ready to move on to the other utility that you mentioned, which was